Hello everyone. Today we are talking with Fiona Clerc from Columbia University about her recent publication in Nature Communications on how deglaciation of ice caps or ice sheets can lead to an increased generation of melt in the Earth's mantle. And this increased melt generation in turn can lead to an increased flux of volatiles such as CO2 that then might be released to the atmosphere and potentially imply a positive feedback between climate warming and deglaciation. Um, yeah, so in your study is based on the premise that deglaciation or glacial unloading leads to mantle melt generation. So could you just quickly walk us through the mechanism behind this? Why do we have increased melt generation when there's glacial unloading?
Yeah, so like as a glacier retreats over the Earth, it is reducing the pressures that are in the mantle, and that effect will be more important at closest to where the ice is. So for a larger ice sheet, then the rates of decompression will be larger at greater depths. You can imagine like an ice cube, if you were to compress it or decompress it, you might induce a phase change. So you might, under compression, you might cause the ice to melt. And so mantle rocks kind of work in the opposite way, where if you decompress it, if you're reducing the pressure, then you're generating more partial melting. So there's these small pockets of molten rock within the larger mantle rock and then those small pockets will grow as you're decompressing the rock. And so that's the basis of the study is as the ice sheet is retreating, you're decompressing the mantle, and then you're generating melts at depth. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And then taking this mechanism to the study location of your work, which is Yellowstone, using Yellowstone as a case study, you're looking at the deglaciation of the Yellowstone ice cap. Could you just quickly walk us through the time frame? So when did this deglaciation happen? When did it stop, or when was it finished? And also, can you give us a scale? So what's the size or the volume of this ice cap that we're talking about here?
I guess the most recent deglaciation of Yellowstone happened in a time frame of like 22 to 13,000 years ago. And so the size of the ice cap, it's asymmetric, but on one axis it's roughly 50 kilometers, and on the other axis it's roughly 150 kilometers. So it's this ellipse that is shaped by the topography of the caldera at Yellowstone. And the thickness of the ice, we presume, would be roughly 1 kilometer thick.
At other locations where this happened, like I think in your paper you mentioned Iceland, for example, the such a deglaciation and increased mantle melt generation led to increased volcanic activity. But you write that this didn't happen at Yellowstone. I assume there were no increased volcanic eruption, for example. Do you have any idea why this is the case? Is this because it's a different tectonic setting, or what's the underlying reason for this?
So I think that was one of the key motivations for studying Yellowstone, is that there haven't been any volcanic eruptions for the last like 70,000 years. But today, like the Yellowstone is currently emitting something like 3% of the global magmatic CO2 flux. And so this is presumably by the melts in the mantle crystallizing at depths and then having that CO2 seep upwards through the rock to the surface. So this is where the modeling comes in, right? Is because we don't have. So in Iceland, you can look to these enhanced volcanic eruptions and look at the record of like lava flows, and then make an estimate of how much extra CO2 was present there. But since we don't have that in Yellowstone, this is why we wanted to use a numerical model to test this idea.
Okay. And then instead of the increased volcanic activity, you are, as you just mentioned, you're modeling the gas that was generated by the mantle melting. So can you walk us through how much gas or how much volatiles there were generated, and do we know whether they were released to the environment or to the atmosphere, and over which time frame? Or is this really just all in the modeling realm?
So in our model, we predicted somewhere between like 18 and 79 gigatons of extra CO2 that were generated, due to this effect of enhanced melting in the mantle. But we don't make any. So our model, because we're not resolving like the dynamics of like how those melts are traveling to the surface, and because I guess in general the transit of CO2 from the mantle to the surface is pretty poorly understood from like a theoretical standpoint. We don't really make any estimates about how quickly this would reach the surface. But these volumes are still large enough that, in one extreme case where they are released immediately, that would have had a pretty profound influence in terms of how much CO2 was released during the following the last glacial maximum. And the flip side of it being that if they are being released very slowly since 18,000 years ago to the present, then that would imply that the flux of CO2 that we're seeing from Yellowstone today is abnormally elevated compared to whatever background CO2 release that you would have without these deglacial effects.
Okay, and so then I guess the main conclusion of this work would be that we can or we cannot, so I think that's my question to you, can we establish that there is a positive feedback between, or a positive feedback loop between a slightly warming climate that, let's say, leads to deglaciation, and then this deglaciation triggers mantle melting, which can even which can even increase climate warming through the release of CO2?
Yeah, so I guess we're looking at like a single location. So we don't like make any claims about global feedbacks, but that is definitely the the motivation right for this work is to understand whether those feedbacks between volcanism and glaciation and increasing CO2 can be important. And something else that we also consider in this paper is that in many ways, like the mantle beneath Yellowstone has some similarities with like the mantle beneath like modern ice sheets, such as Greenland or West Antarctica. And so given that those ice sheets are so much larger than you might imagine as they're retreating, they might also be inducing this effect. And so you would say that maybe this feedback between deglaciation and CO2 and mantle melting isn't just something that is happening only at Yellowstone, but could be a more global phenomenon too.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think this would be all my questions I have.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.